Hi, and welcome to Growing the Edge, the show about transformation. So today is our Halloween special, and it's all about the dark side of transformation. So it's pretty simple. We've got a number of guests, and the only rules are really three. We need to dress for radio, don't be boring.
So it's pretty simple. We've got a number of guests,
and always notice the lag on going live, and always remember the rule of three. So our first guest is Chris Sherrington. Chris, I don't know you, so maybe you can sort of...
Yeah, we've never met before at all.
Yeah, we've never met.
No, I'm not really your mate from work at all.
No, exactly. So, you know, we work for an energy company, so we don't know anything about the dark side of transformation, really, do we?
Shut up, Rach. Shall I briefly introduce myself? So, yeah, my name's Chris, and I work in IT, and I'd like to work in something else. No. I've probably been involved in transformation for about 20 years because I've been trying to change things for about 20 years. I think I've got blood on my hands from a number of big SAP implementations across Europe, which I could go on about the dark side of those for quite a while. But I think I'm at a stage where I think I'm comfortable enough that I think I want to share some of the interesting things that I've noticed trying to change stuff. And I think, Chris, you sort of kicked this off by sort of saying, well, let's talk about the dark side of transformation. And I went away and thought about, rather than being drawn to well, what do you mean by transformation? And sort of circle that plug hole for a little bit. I started emphasizing, and I have no idea why, but the thing that came into my head, and it was a really strange, strong memory of a joke book as a child. And there was a particular joke, and I make no apologies for this being a very bad joke. So, what's the one thing you need to know before you teach a dog new tricks? More than the dog. And I think, for some reason, that just came into my head, and I was thinking about it, and out of that, I decided to sort of just follow that particular little white rabbit down the hole. And what I came to the conclusion is that all of us, and there are people going to be on the show later who probably have broader things to say about how things are link up, but all of us, when we embark on a transformation, do it with an understanding that we know more than the dog. Yeah. And that puts you in a dangerous place. And I think that's where my thoughts about transformation dark side is. What are the traps? And those traps aren't personal, and they're about how you enter into this. I liked the jokes because obviously I've just described the thing that I'm going to transform as a dog, which was already not a nice
thing.
So
I don't know more than my dog. What happened is my dog wouldn't come in. He wouldn't come in for, when I said come, so I'm a really bad dog owner. So he would come in for treat. But now what I've done is he won't do come, so I have to say treat. And now what he does, he'll run out and bark at the other dog, so it annoys me, and I have to call him in. I call treat, and he gets his treat. So
tail wag dog, that is, Chris.
Exactly. And I think this is the point, that you set yourself up to be the expert to some extent, and if you go in with that attitude, obviously things go bad. And by following that thought, and Chris, you and I have talked about this, where the unintended consequences of transformation, some of the behaviours that you possibly drive into people, and how to approach those perhaps a bit more charitably than you can find yourself. I mean, in the chat before the show started, we talked about the perseverance and sometimes the draining effect of having to do this. And there's a behaviour that I've recognised that I wanted to almost revisit and ask myself with that sort of, why do I think I know more than X? If I do, what does that do to me and how to go wrong? Which is what I've sometimes called cargo cult behaviour during transformation. And there is this interesting sort of anthropological observation that particularly during World War II, in the islands of the South Pacific, there's a group of people who had, before the US Air Force turned up, had never encountered such bounty and technology. In a very short period of time, they had airstrips being built on their islands and large amounts of machinery, equipment, but food, sugar, and all sorts of stuff which they'd never seen before entered their lives, was around for a couple of years and then just disappeared. And the result of that, the sort of what it's done to those cultures, is they have now formed cults around cargo. They build control towers. They have their religious rituals have changed to reflect this, and they are trying to some extent conjure back those days of bounty. And they, you know, some anthropologists called it cargo cult. And I think in about 1974, Richard Feynman, as I quite like Richard Feynman, I've been reading his stuff, he gave, I think, a speech at Cornell where he talked about cargo cult science and not wanting to fool yourself, etc., etc. And I've really liked that. And I began to notice during transformation cargo cults beginning to emerge. And I think I wanted to check with you, Chris, if you've, and by the way, you should call me on with this about which one of these I've made up. Right. So there's a thing actually that, this is in my household, myself and my partner, because we both experienced it. And we do have an in-joke called I has a process. And this is the thing that only exists in PowerPoint. And it's held up as this sort of totem of, well, it can't be wrong because we've got this, and it's all going to be fixed because of this. Where the existence of a particular thing that we all agreed on is therefore the transformation. So that's almost like the lowest level of one, and I think that tends to happen at the small group level.
And I've seen, Chris, I've seen the videos on YouTube with some of those cargo cults, and
it's real.
It's tragic. I mean, it made me quite upset that they can't make sense of what's going on, but they think they make sense. They've woven a narrative, and then they're playing out the narrative rather than reality.
Exactly. So the next one was, agile theatre. Yeah, I'm sure you're all aware that Kanban is the Japanese word for post-it note, and what you tend to see people is beginning to catch on to the obvious symbols and signals of perhaps whatever methodology you're trying to teach. And it's being played out in front of you, but none of it's gone any deeper. And of course, I think its ultimate incarnation is the sort of innovation theatre of, innovation labs, etc. Where, and I've been, on both sides of this, where you end up conjuring up little examples of stuff for the edification of executives, whatever. Look at us, we're doing innovation.
So, Chris, are people like rushing? Why are they cargo? Why are we prone to actually having a superficial understanding of something and then cracking on?
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this was a conversation you and I had about how this is a rational response. And this is almost wanted to call it rational magical thinking, because what else are they supposed to do? And going back to just where I started in terms of you turned up and you felt you knew more than the dog. When you see this. And like you say, cargo cult behavior in real life, it's very easy to see it as being in a pejorative way. You ultimately end up making jokes about the tribe that worship Prince Philip. It's a thing, it's real, and you realize that actually this is your fault. You did this. There's nothing funny about a group of people trying to replicate using post-it notes and whiteboards what you tried to teach them. There's nothing funny about somebody just thinking that a PowerPoint is enough. That was your fault. It was your hubris that you knew more than them. So what was it you came to teach? Because you've clearly taught the wrong things. Their coping strategy, and this is a fundamental coping strategy, it doesn't matter how advanced or less advanced whatever your culture is. This is how people deal with stuff, and this time it's your fault. And I think that was what I mean by the dark side, is that's where just one of the dark places I've been of going, see, they've really misunderstood. And it's like that, that one's on me.
So in actual fact, they were kind of giving packages and stuff to the locals and zooming in with their planes rather than actually saying, well, how could we help them? Or do we need to help them? Or what is our role here?
But also coming up after the fact. The second wave of people turning up and going, look at these funny people and their funny little wooden aeroplanes, and they've made little headphones, and they're trying to, this is a completely rational response. It's a basic human response to see patterns, replicate the patterns. So if you're going in to transform and understand that people's immediate reaction, and sometimes the the shocking things we do to people as transformation. We are trying to turn their world upside down, and some of us get paid to do that. Other people have to deal with our crap, and this is, and I guess is that sort of. Well, I know you and I, Chris, have been kicking this one around for a while.
Yeah. So, does anybody want to come in on this?
I wanted to just quickly ask you, Chris. So, are you saying, with that kind of analogy with the dog and the trick? So, is there no? Are you saying that there's no honesty in transformation, and
I think
that's why?
No, I think that the honesty must start with what have you come to teach? Because you've got this thing where I'm thinking of the cycles I've been through of, right, I know all the answers and come to transform you. Why aren't you transforming? To then a cycle of maturity to then turn up with some humility to say, fine, but that's still not enough, because I think it's about being, as you say, being honest about what you've come to teach, and remember that the tools and the immediately obvious stuff is what people are going to grab hold of, and you need to keep coming back to the fundamental thing you're trying to achieve, but also, Chris, your point about, because so often this is done through consultation, by consultants or by program or whatever. At some point, you're going to pack up your little airstrip and your little Air Force, and you're going to fly off to the next one. And you're typically leaving people with the equivalent of that, with some post-it notes and board tips, etc. And I think a much more longer-term view, and is a much more of a sustainable, if you like, as in what have I actually put in here? Because I guess it's just the experience I've had of being disappointed in my own work, where and it's come from this dark side trap perhaps I'm trying to describe. I hope I've come close to answering your question, Mandy.
Yeah, I think so.
I might not do.
No, sorry, it's not from Mandy's side. Mandy, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I think, what you're saying makes sense. Equally, transformation and agile, we all know it's about discovery. And, even with the dog and the tricks, it's discovery. You don't know everything. And actually, I love what you've just said, because yes, coming in with that level of humility is what's desired by everybody, because I don't think anybody loves somebody coming in saying, oh, I've got the biggest kahootas, I know what to do. I don't think that's the case,
Oh, no, I agree, but I think also you've got to work through that there is a reason you've gone there. You have something to teach. So you've got to go back to, what is the value I am bringing? Why? And I guess it's this weird cycle I felt from one being confident that I know what to do, then knowing that I know nothing, and then getting to, right, I do know more than the dog, you're saying, but the dog also knows more than me, and both of us are going to be transformed by this experience. It's got me to a better place, but also the fact that you do what you are doing to people during transformation. So
I've got a couple of I've just got a couple of questions or comments from Dave Pendle. So he's saying, first of all, the pitfalls of the expert position. Can you ever be an expert in transformation? And then the next thing he said, and then maybe the illusion/delusion is having something to teach. Now, this actually brings me to something that I was chatting with colleagues last week about, is, are we all experts on transformation? And we need to just kind of, discover that for ourselves rather than being told it's this or it's that.
I'd like to chip in with some. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
No, just an observation about this discussion is that we're really talking about what you might call reflective observation or reflection. So, as we intervene in situations, as we become aware of the emergent properties of the situations, we're reflecting on what we're doing, and we're encouraging other people to reflect on what's going on in them. And I think that, if transformation means anything, it means establishing reflection, establishing an awareness, a higher level of consciousness than existed before, so that every party that's coming to the table is aware of their potential, is aware of their impact, is aware of what they could be contributing, and is respectful of the diversity of the other people who are also participating. So transformation is very much, I think, it's like you could think of it as being a dialectic process going from being to becoming. And if you establish these circles of reflection, then transformation won't just start and do a little thing. It'll keep going. And I think some of the things we've been talking about are actually reflection, but we maybe need to make reflection explicit and say, a key part of transformation is making the reflection and the observation explicit, so everybody understands this is how it needs to be.
Yeah, and also, Tim, I remember many years ago, we were going to do a release, and it was going to impact many customers. And I just remember saying to one of the developers, "Oh God, I'm just praying that this release is going to be okay." And she, very categorically said, we shouldn't have to pray. We shouldn't be in that kind of a vulnerable situation when we're making things go live, and we're dealing with people who pay for the services and the products. And and it's just interesting how you're talking about reflection, because we don't know sometimes. We just don't know. We put something out there that goes live, and oh shit, you know what? There is a bug. We're going to have to deal with this.
Is that not down to the process, Mandy? So isn't that back to what Chris is saying? I remember meeting some transformation experts and me saying, well, what is that then? Who are you? You've sold yourself as that. And they said, oh, we bring transformation in a bag. And I remember laughing at them and going, oh, don't laugh. You've not seen what's in the bag yet. And so I said, oh, come on then, show me what's in your bag. And in their bag was an entire kit of Post-it notes and guidance and instructions they could shove into organisations that they could buy easily.
Right?
And absolutely, and leave them with their bag of tricks so that the dogs could play. And what's really problematic in transformation is that we're not brave enough to challenge each other on our thinking. We're not following it through in a robust way. We're not engaging the wider stakeholder groups because we don't want to be wrong. Our fear of being wrong prevents us from feeling like we got it right.
So what we're also then talking about, Caroline, is there's the power dynamic here. There's like a power differential and things which is there. And so I'm wondering at this point whether we want to just bring maybe Tim and Ben in for a conversation. Go for it.
Great.
I just have a stab at. So I've
of course.
listening to what's just transpired, and a couple of things have come up for me in listening to that. Is we seem to approach transformation from the point of view of what have I come to teach, but from what everyone's been saying, perhaps we should be approaching the transformation from what have I come to learn. Like, what can I learn about how my organization interacts with its environment, how it needs to change interacting with its environment, and coming with a preconceived bag of, what magic that's going to somehow fit when it fitted before is just, that's how we got into the problem in the first place, right? Because we're not learning about our environment, situational awareness.
Brilliant. I love it. It's starting to sound a bit like an Agile manifesto value. It's like learning over teaching.
Well, I'm in full agreement there. I suppose, I don't know if is anyone familiar with the Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and the ecologist who talked about levels of learning? Is that something that is familiar with you? Bateson's level of learning.
I'm going to show off here.
Oh, you've got it. Okay. Great. Steps to an ecology of mind. What he observed is that learning that humans can do is fundamentally different from learning that machines can do, and he identified this 30 years ago, because machines don't make mistakes. So effectively, machines follow algorithms, and he used the term zero learning to apply to following an algorithm. If you don't make a mistake, you're doing zero learning, because whatever you're doing is you're following some algorithms which will produce some certain outputs. The only way you can really achieve higher levels of learning, and he describes level 1, level 2, level 3, potential level 4 learning. Only way you can achieve higher levels of learning is by making mistakes. So effectively, if we take just a simple analogy of, say, coaching, somebody has perhaps they're a golfer and they're taking a golf swing, and at level 1, the coach could give them feedback to the person saying, this is how to make your stroke more powerful. This is how to, and they could give you feedback. That's a 7, that's an 8, and they could give you feedback. But at some point, a decision needs to be made. Well, you've done enough now on power. Now we need to focus on accuracy, or now we need to focus on consistency. So there's some other aspect that we need to focus on. So as soon as you change the focus of learning, you're making a level 2 decision, because you're reprioritizing the focus of learning, and that's a higher level thing, and that's something that humans can do, animals can do. They can change their focus. Maybe Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That needs being met. I change focus onto a different thing. Now, when you start doing even higher levels of learning, so you maybe reflect on, well, how do I go about deciding whether to do this thing or that thing? So you're at a higher level of reflection. Level 3 learning, you're going to be rationalizing, how is it that I'm going about making my level 2 decisions to decide to prioritize this or that? And that level of learning, that level 3, gets you into existential questions like, why am I here? What's my purpose? What are my values? So effectively, Bateson has neatly given us a conceptual framework for thinking about different types of learning. And what I see very often happening, and going into the dark side question, people are treating all learning and all transformation as the same thing. But in a complex program, you're going to have all different types of learning. You're going to have very basic fine-tuning type of learning, which you can automate and you can give to computers. And then you're going to have prioritizing what people do, which is going to be getting into sort of level 2 stuff. And then you're going to get at a higher level existential things like, why are we here? What's our purpose? And these will be level 3 things. Most organizations get this all jumbled up, and they don't understand the different types of learning that are going on and need to go on, how need to feed into each other.
Yeah. So Tim, I haven't read the book, to my embarrassment. So that was a bit of hubris. Jay Bryan. Funnily enough, so Nora Bateson hopefully will come on the show in a few weeks' time. So that's Gregory's daughter, and she's got some great books.
So you've got time to read the book then.
Yeah. So my higher purpose is to bring Ben in, because he hasn't spoken yet.
No, and to the last point, I agree completely. And I kind of look at it from a game theory point of view. Even though we don't like looking at life like a game, we can model it like one. And the 2 features I want to use here are an infinite and finite player, and the what versus the why. Because a lot of the time, as individuals, we are the finite player going up against a lot of infinite machines in the system, in this game. And a lot of the time, like we've been speaking now, it's a lot of focus on what happened here, what happened there. And you want to change the what. But the what is downstream of the why. And in finance, I talk to a lot of people, and it's you're going to draw your golden triangles and your ratios of death of these things. But it's all of this information is downstream of the why. And if you don't know where you're going, it's like smelling a waterfall and trying to figure out where the source is.
So Ben, part of that is knowing where you've been as well, isn't it? So if you think about it, IT used to be, the people that told you to turn it off and turn it back on again. And now they're leading digital transformations. And whenever
We still do that.
Digital transformation,
it still works as well.
Yeah.
works for me every time. In fact, that's the advice you gave me, Chris, the other day. So
it was. I mean, I've got pretty far in my career with basically telling people that advice.
Turn it off and turn it on again.
Yeah.
So, but the reality is that we're now having digital transformations being the leaders of the shared services in where people go to. And when I speak to digital transformation experts on programs, quite often they'll say, but the new system will dictate the behavior of the people, and that's how we'll create change. And they forget to bring the people with them. based on that result. And so the why gets lost because the digital teams are looking at the what. So how do we create this task? How do we make it work? How do we move forward? What does the outcome need to look like? And all the people are saying, why am I bothered? Why do I care? Why do I want to be on that journey? What difference does it make to me? And how can I corrupt it? Because that does something to my ego at the same time. So it's a really interesting space of, yeah, absolutely, why are we here and what we're doing and what does that mean for our purpose? But also, where have we been? And organisationally, IT, have come out of their dark cupboards without necessarily the people skills or the people lens that allows people to move forward, and that can be part of the dark side too.
Yeah, so this and I suppose an existential questions, there's always darkness there, isn't there?
Yeah.
Can I just
about the big stuff.
Just because I quite like where the conversation's gone, and someone's going to have to link me to that book because now I feel like I need to read it. But in that book and that model, because it talks about a hierarchy, Tim, and I'm just taking Ben's point of, is there, because I'm connecting this to, I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place, but is there a hierarchy of whys? Because what I've noticed, and picking up on Ben's point, sitting people down to explain the why, it's a different why for lots of different stakeholders, isn't it? If there was one unifying why, this would be easy.
Yeah,
Well, it would. You just explain it once, and everyone would go, absolutely, so, we'll get on it.
Exactly.
Well, it's not just that. It's not just a hierarchy of whys, is it? It's actually it's almost a contingency of whys, because that's what they talk in Six Sigma about having the 6 whys, because you have to ask why multiple times, because there will always be a sequence of whys, and contingency means that a series of things have happened before that constrain the situation you're in and the context you're in, and you have to ask why multiple times to unpeel the contingencies and to get back to previous events. Yeah,
I guess I don't disagree, but I'm just thinking that also that I'm peeling back the layers of drilling down, but also I'm just thinking of situations where they don't relate to each other. The why of a senior executive relating to a digital transformation, blah blah blah, and when you're on the shop floor and they go, oh really, yeah, so that means nothing to me. I cannot connect that. So why should I join in with this? And that's what I mean about there is a hierarchy, and and I'm thinking of the org hierarchy.
Is there also therefore a uniqueness of why? Just bring in J. Brian Hennessy, who's watching. Is there also a natural selection of why?
Yeah, there is.
I would like
selection.
Yeah, so Ben S and then Ben F.
Sorry. Like for me, like the why, if you boil the why of the why down, it comes down for me to incentive. Like, what is the incentive here? And like literally Charlie Munger's famous quote is, show me the incentive, I show you the outcome. Because if you know where people's motives lie and everything else, who's juxtaposed to do what prior to even knowing what's happening. And the output then is almost obvious.
And this actually brings me to, I wrote an article that nobody understood. Well, almost all of my articles like that, but I did one last year about, and it was like, let Hedy Lamarr de-block your digital transformation with burner phones. And nobody understood what the hell I was on about. But what I was trying to do is I was trying to get to the point that we use terms, we recuperate language that we don't understand, cargo cult, and therefore the people who do understand, they can't use the language anymore because the recuperative meaning takes over. So it's like a burner phone for like a county lines gang. So I have to throw it away and I have to get a new thing. So for example, agile, that's burner phone. We then talk about DevOps, then that goes burner phone. Then we have to talk about what else? Cell structure design. So that's the thing. And it reminds me actually, so Chris, you and I, with Dave, who will be coming on soon, we're at Map Camp with Simon Wardley last year. And he was talking about, he knew that Wardley mapping had hit the mainstream because there's tons of people getting it wrong.
That's a definition of success, isn't it? Yeah. And I think that euphemism treadmill thing, that you just things get worn out and have to be reinvented, sometimes necessarily, and other times, unfortunately, because they just get chewed up and used badly. I'm still on the natural selection idea for whys. And that they're now red in tooth and claw, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Very good.
To the
Tennyson.
hierarchy of whys, I think a great way to find it is to take like your hierarchy of needs and just incentivize that and get your hierarchy of incentives against that, and it's like a great place to start of what does a hierarchy of whys look like.
The one thing that I'm thinking about is when I am thinking of situations where there is a huge rift, and the thing that's, and I will probably get this wrong because I can't remember the circumstances under which it was said, but I do remember in a political context, someone being told, a vox pop for someone of, well, this is good, isn't it? Because it's good for GDP. And it was, yeah, but that's your GDP, not mine. Which obviously sounds stupid when it's first said. Well, of course it's our GDP. We're all part of the same now. But if you're not getting the benefit of that, because obviously, and I've been in transformations where at the lower level of the organization, they don't see any difference. And it is very, very difficult to make that connection of who paid you to be there, why you're doing it, all that sort of stuff. And then you reach a level of people whose behavior you want to change, and they're not actually getting the benefit from it, because the game's not been set up to benefit them, actually.
And also, Chris, there's also this notion of the people who may not be getting it actually do get it, because actually their jobs are at risk. You're going to make everything go. You're going to make everything go online. Yeah. Nothing's going to be left on the high street, and they are not idiots. They know what's happening. Yeah, so there's this that whole kind of benefits realization piece is just.
There's a lovely fictional quote, which Chris is Upton Sinclair. You know it. Upton Sinclair from I think a book written about 1926, Metropolis, a fictional book, but Upton Sinclair wrote the classic quote. It's hard to get a man to understand something when his job depends on not understanding it, and there are so many situations where if somebody perceives that something is going to change, their livelihood, their self-interest, they will establish remarkable barriers to understanding it.
Resistance is not futile; it's rational. Under those circumstances.
I went into an organisation and did a transformation programme that put all of their jobs at risk. And I remember being in a workshop with them and going, well, look, these are your results and they're all shit. This is customer experience and it's shit. So what are we going to do about it? We've got this SAP programme coming in. We know that we're going to have to turn stuff off and it might not work and all of that stuff. So why don't we reimagine ourselves and our service proposition and try and save your jobs? And I knew that my aim within that contract was to reduce the jobs. So it's not a magic wand that I had. And interestingly, because of the buy-in to what we were trying to do, they all said, no, we don't want to do that. We would rather that the customer actually got a better experience because they've not had that opportunity the entire time that we've been here. And that was a collective view. And in the end, another chief came in and changed the programme, and they were all up in arms about it. And so you can create enough of a purpose that people can align to where they will sacrifice themselves. And if you can make them sacrifice themselves, you can pretty much get them on board with anything. It can happen. It's just that we don't believe that people are altruistic in that way, and they can be.
Hi, Dave.
Hello. Hi, Chris.
Welcome to the show. So, Dave, we've been talking about the dark side of transformation. Does somebody want to catch Dave up a little bit, just so you've got a little bit of context sort of coming in?
Hi, Dave. I mean, I think I kicked us off with just sharing some of my experience of people latching on to the surface, the tools and props of transformation, and you're doing what you think is a transformation. You've come in to make a big change. The only thing you leave behind, and I made a similarity with some of the cargo cult stuff, that this is something you end up doing to people. Their behavior is actually rational, that they're trying to make sense of this. And instead you've left them with whiteboards and post-it notes. And that just while we were talking about the dark side, that's on you. that was because you came in and you thought you knew better. So there's a sort of a trap for the people that come in to do this, and it's not the fault of the organisation you were trying to change. They're doing what people have done under these circumstances all the time. Where did we go after that, guys? I think someone else. I mean, Tim, you started talking about.
I was talking about reflexivity, and I was talking about the fact that all of the agents in a transformation kind of need to understand the dynamics of the situation and the fact that they are being changed, and really encourage that reflection, because it's only through encouraging reflection that you're going to create the right change for that situation. I also brought in the idea of Bateson and his logical categories of learning, and so that people often in transformation, the different categories of learning aren't recognized, and particularly the limits of machine learning, where machines don't make mistakes, and therefore people over rely on machines that don't make mistakes, where they should be relying on people who do make mistakes and can reflect on those mistakes. So I was really trying to sort of probe that aspect of the dark side of transformation. And then, do you want to speak for yourself rather than have somebody represent you?
Yeah, no, then I just introduced, I guess, the game theory aspect of it, and saying that you can change the what happens all you want, but if you're not addressing the underlying why, then it almost is like an exercise in futility.
So you're pretty much caught up now, Dave.
Okay, so how long do you want? 10 minutes, and then open up a conversation?
Yeah, or take a bit longer, actually, because it's kind of a bit more free form. So if you want longer.
Okay, let me start up by picking on something Ben said at the end there, which is important. Which, if you don't understand why, you've got a problem. And this is one of the things we're talking about in management science, which is the switch from inductive thinking to abductive thinking. Right? Now, this is key, all right? If you look at what currently happens in management science, somebody goes and studies 20 companies which they deem to be successful. So let's hold whether they are or not for the moment, because if we look at good to great, none of those companies survived anyway. Right? But we'll pretend that works. Yeah? Then they identify things that those companies did in common. And then they create a recipe which says, do these things, you too will be successful. Now, in real science, that's called the confusion of correlation with causation. So the fact that 90% of CEOs of American corporates play golf doesn't mean that you replace management training with golf courses, even though it might be more desirable. Yeah? And what I really love on this is that if you want to increase Nobel Prizes per head of population, all you have to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. Because dark chocolate consumption and Nobel Prizes per head of population correlate over the last 30 years. And that's more data than most people have got when they produce management theory. Yeah? And then, of course, it gets even worse because you get complete nonsense. Well, let me give you my two least favorite books within the Agile community, for example. One is Lean Startup. And what happens is a guy goes and interviews people he knows who were successful, and on that takes the recipe. Now, he bothered to check the literature. He discovered we did a big project with Harvard back in IBM, and we also studied companies who failed. I mean, this is kind of like basic research, all right? Don't just do the success, do the failure. We found they all did exactly the same thing. The basic fact is that when you're studying entrepreneurs, you're dealing with a market. So some people are bound to succeed for a numbers game. Yeah, so you can't take that across. And he completely ignored the literature on entrepreneurship, which is how you create entrepreneurial behavior within a more restricted number set. Yeah. And then the worst is Lacroix is reinventing the organization, which is a religious fanatic trying to find evidence to support an unsustainable proposition. I mean, it all sounds beautiful, but it's just bad science. Yeah, he doesn't even report the aspects of his cases which contradict his theory. So we've had this case-based inductive approach, right? The big problem I work on, which was originally set when I was working with counter-terrorism in DARPA days. And I met this doddery old man who I got on with really well, and then I discovered he was Admiral John Poindexter, and a good Welsh socialist. I'm not meant to like Republicans. particularly ex-Reagan national security advisors, but he's a good friend. And the problem he eventually set is, how do you objectify abduction? Now, abduction in logic, which is a great contribution of the American pragmatists, is the unexpected connection between apparently unconnected things. And the big problem with abduction is, how do you make that objective? So how do you say this person's intuitive link is more accurate than that person? And that I spent 5 years of my life working on, and we produced a solution for that, which is currently deployed. And it's basically by getting 1,000 people from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds to interpret something and looking at the patterns in that interpretation. So if you get a common pattern, you've got what we call coherence, and coherence is a key concept in complexity science. So basically, evolutionary theory is probably wrong, but it's coherent to the facts, whereas young earth creationism is incoherent to the facts, so it's not worthy of pursuit. So coherence gives you a, we will explore this because it's worth looking at, yeah, in that sense. So the big thing in abduction is you're now in the tails of a Pareto distribution rather than the center of a Gaussian distribution. All right, so in a fat tail, you've got many possibilities. You have to identify two things. One is where there's a reasonable coherence around this is probably a solution. But the other thing you're looking for are outliers. So to give the classic experiment on this, if you give radiologists a set of x-rays, and on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of the Kaplan object, and you ask the radiologist to notice anomalies, then actually 83% won't see the gorilla, even though their eyes physically scan it. Right? Now that just invalidates any consultant who actually goes to study something, because you do not see what you do not expect to see.
So Dave, does that mean to some extent this is related to how we've trained our minds? Is that more to do with the agrarian rather than a hunter-gatherer?
No. It's much more fundamental than that, all right?
Right.
So the way this actually works is, if you scan about 3 to 4% of what's available to you. Yeah? If you're Chinese, it doubles. That we think that's due to language development, because symbolic languages require more awareness of context. For most people in this group, it's 5%. That's if you really focus. Most of the time, it's 1 or 2%. And that triggers memories, some of which, by the way, are physical. I'll come back to that in a minute, because the over-focus on a Cartesian concept of consciousness is also a big problem. Yeah, it's why, and that hits the coaching market and everything else. But fundamentally, right, your body and your mind, all of you, it triggers memory. They can be motor memories in the body, they can be abstract memories, whatever. And then you do what's called conceptual blending. So you blend those together. This happens very quickly, and you make a decision accordingly. Now, in evolutionary terms, you can see why that develops, and it's a persistent one. The early hominids on the savannas of Africa, if something large and yellow with sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed, do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and have identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to avoid being eaten by lions? You know, by the time you've gone through that process, the only thing of value to you, well, the only written text will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, yet written by a purported survivor. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly, privileging our most recent histories. And also we evolved to make those decisions collectively, not individually. We're clan-based creatures, yeah? And actually in a hunting group, specialized roles emerge. So I'll throw another bit of cognitive science in on this, right? So if you want to do an innovation program, we put young people together with old people. And this is based on brain plasticity. So by the time you're in your early 20s, you lock down. You actually don't see racism in kids until they hit puberty. Puberty is a trigger. So from puberty, they start to adopt the prejudices of their society because it's an efficiency issue. If you have the longest educational period of any mammal, you've got to go and hunt for the tribe. If you survive into your late 40s, you've obviously got something about you, but you're not physically up to leading the tribe anymore. So you're going to childcare and teaching. And his interest in brain plasticity up to puberty, well, up to about early 20s, is flashes of inspiration. Over 45, 50, which is chemically triggered, the plasticity male and female alike, it's synthesis and integration. Yeah? So once we know that, what we do is we put young people with old people in innovation teams, and then put them into a trio with somebody who can make their ideas work, because we get that. And we did this in South Wales with kids with their grandparents. Now, what I'm going through here is a natural science approach to human systems.
So does that mean, Dave, that maybe a dark side element is that we're getting diversity and inclusion kind of wrong with respect to transformation, because we're not looking at these neurological factors?
It's not just that. I think most of the transformation, there are 2 or 3 problems with transformation, right? One is the desire for homogenization, which sort of pervades most consultancy techniques. We've got to have common objectives, common goals, common visions. We've got to be aligned. And I had this argument with Peter Senge once when I accused him of neo-colonialism, which I'm still prepared to defend, because he's terribly neo-colonialist. It's kind of like, if everybody was like me and Otto, the world would be a better place. Well, the English have been saying that in Wales in the 14th century, in India in the 18th century, and they've been doing it all over Africa as well. So I don't buy that, all right? So part of the issue here is it's not about the individual, it's about the collective. And it's actually not about transformation. Because if you focus on transformation and transformation programs, people will play games with what you're talking about. Yeah, they're basically, oh my God, we've got a change program. What's the new words? Right? What's the new language of power? Yeah? And the big difference between complexity thinking and systems thinking, which came before it, is we don't have goals, we have a sense of direction. So all of the systems thinking method, and this is the underlying principle of transformation, is we say what we want to be, and we assume we can make it happen. In complexity, you say, what's a coherent direction of travel? How do we start that journey? And you're open to transformation on the journey, but it's not an objective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what we got is a focus problem. We're focusing so much on it, we're actually missing something. We're not using the peripheral approach.
And the other problem is the inheritance of Jung.
Yeah.
If you want a key phrase, given a choice between Jung and Aristotle, go for Aristotle every time, right? And don't even talk about Plato. But the problem is the inheritance of Jung comes out of a Cartesian concept of consciousness, right? So this is a concept that consciousness resides in the brain. And that goes back to Descartes. And as Midgley has said, the reason Descartes did that was to separate the soul from the body so that he wouldn't get burnt alive at the stake if he did science. That was the motivation. I mean, Midgley works that out really well. Yeah. So what then happens is we get Freud and we get Jung, and we get this nonsensical idea that there's such a thing as a subconscious, which there isn't, right? And you get into these highly paternalistic coaching methods, which have come across into the coaching market. And the assumption is if I change individuals, the system can be changed. And you can only change individuals by getting them to articulate a trauma, which of course gives power to the therapist. Yeah? Now, the reality is that consciousness is extended, embodied, enacted. Yeah, it's actually consciousness is a distributed function, the brain, the body, social interactions, even its narrative, if you go to Andy Clark. And again, that changes the way we have to do organizational change, because actually doing things often has a bigger effect than talking about things. Yeah, and forcing people to articulate things gives power to the person who is creating the articulation, not the people themselves. There's a key concept here called epistemic justice or cognitive sovereignty. Yeah. Beth, who works for me, has got a brilliant way of phrasing this. She says epistemic injustice, feminist concept, is old men are philosophers where old wives tell tales. If you look at what that language does, yeah, it disenfranchises people. Yeah. The other problem, and there's a related problem on this in terms of cognitive style. So the world is dominated by people from Northern Europe and North America, who in culture are socially atomistic. So they believe that society is an aggregation of individual decisions. And actually, Protestantism grew out of that. The concept you have an individual relationship with God, and it's all personal. Yeah, that's called social atomism. If you look at Africa, Asia, and interestingly, the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish, as well as Latin America, they're commutarian. So they define themselves by their social interactions. They don't define society by their needs. You're actually seeing a radical difference to COVID, for example, in Wales or England and Scotland. There's a different approach, in terms of the way it works. Now, again, that's a problem because most of the language of management is the language of individuals and leaders. It's not the language of community and social interaction. Yeah, and so if you come from those backgrounds, you're actually severely disadvantaged. Yeah? I mean, I'll help on this. Wales was England's first colony, if you don't know it, 14th century. And every time the English invaded Wales, they had more Welsh troops fighting for them than they did English. Because the way the English created an empire was to actually split tribes and split people and have them fight each other. Yeah? Now, you can see it even in the modern day, all right? So I remember the Welsh Plaid Cymru leader getting satirised on BBC for her accent. And if you remember when Neil Kinnock was leader of the Labour Party, the Welsh tradition is a rhetorical tradition. If we argue with you, it means we like you. If we're being polite, we don't trust you. And I never explained this to my wife when she came home because she was English. Well, she's Huguenot, I claim that background. Because the family took 2 years to decide whether they liked her or not, and then they savaged her over dinner, right? I didn't warn her that was coming, right? And Kinnock got satirised as a Welsh windbag because that was the rhetorical tradition. Yeah? And what you see is these linguistic games are played in large companies as well. So that sort of cultural dominance of the focus on the individual is deeply problematic in a world where we actually need people connected not only with other people, but with the planet. Yeah.
And this is something, and this is something that resonates with some of the experiences that we've had in trying to do things, change the narrative, and do things slightly differently in our organisation. Does anybody want to come in and ask? I'm sure people want to ask Dave some questions.
Yeah, I've got a question, Dave. So you mentioned the difference in cognitive performance with people scanning, and you mentioned that Chinese people tend to notice anomalies. Is that, and then you also mentioned this difference in sort of collective versus individualistic leaning with and you included Welsh and Scottish people. Do you happen to know offhand whether that proclivity to notice anomalies is also extends to people that have that kind of contextual group cognition rather than individualistic across the board, or is it just Chinese that you know of?
There's no universal examples on this, all right? So, I mean, it's got upsides and downsides, right? So, I mean, I was wargaming the other day, and I was playing Chinese commander, and we wiped an American fleet out because we couldn't care less how many of our people died. Yeah, whereas the Americans were worried about it. And if you look at Russian strategy in the Second World War, you see the same thing. So there are upsides and downsides to this, right? So if you put, the famous one is you put a picture of a tiger drinking from a stream in a forest. Chinese students will see the forest, but they'll miss the tiger. American students will see the tiger and miss the forest.
Yeah.
If you put a set of objects on a table, Chinese students will talk about the relationship between the objects. Americans will talk about the largest object, right? That's one. There is a factor, and we think that's linked with language, right? So there's a cognitive development, but there's also an experiential development. So one of the things that, I mean, I was lucky, all right? I mean, I prefer to be younger, but I'm quite glad that I'm as old as I am because I went through a generalist education. Right. So when I went to school, I still remember the first thing at the age of 11. All right. I'm now allowed to wear long trousers because we were only allowed to wear short trousers until 11, which in the winter of 1964 with a 3-mile walk to school was, I still remember that. I almost got frostbite that day. But I walked to the front of the class and I was given a card and it said, "You support capital punishment." Now, I think capital punishment is an indication of savagery and barbarism yeah, which is unacceptable in a modern environment. But I had to argue for it for 7 minutes without preparation. And we did that every week from 11 to 18. And if we were any good at it, we were formally taught rhetoric as well. Yeah. Not only that, I mean, I felt like at my A levels, I did pure maths, applied maths, physics, geology, and history. And that was considered, why are you doing history? That was unacceptable. But basically, every book that the English sticks had read, I had read. Because you weren't credible amongst your peers unless you were literate. Yeah, we did a Shakespeare play every year. My mother made me read the Bible by the time I was 11. But she said I wouldn't understand European literature unless I'd read it. And then I punished her by becoming a Catholic. That's another matter, right? She was a good atheist.
So part of the dark side, Dave, then is that we're rewarding people for being literate in platitudes rather than having
not
these.
Just that, we're now creating specialists. We've lost generalists. Yeah. There aren't any generalists left under the age of 50. And my kids went through module by module. They were never out of exam pressure. So all they wanted to do was to complete a module, tick it, forget it, and move on. Right? And what we need on the current planet desperately are generalists. And a generalist is not, I mean, a neo-generalist is not the same thing. If you have deep knowledge in one thing and shallow knowledge in the other, you're not a generalist. Because you're privileged with deep knowledge. Yeah? A real generalist has shallow knowledge of many fields. Yeah, which is why I can do the synthesis. And we've got very few left because the educational system has punished them. And if you want, actually, the most appalling educational initiative at the moment in the world is the Australian one. Because they basically said, if you do STEM education, you have cheap fees. If you want to do the humanities, they up the fees by a factor of 10. Now, that's an 18th century model of education. If you do something by which you can be employable and slave labor in their industry will pay for it. If you want to really think, well, that's for the elite who can afford it. And we're building that back into systems at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'd like to
just an observation.
Sorry,
Ben. I just wanted to make an observation that the objects on the table observation you made, Dave. I've also read somewhere that in Western cultures, if you ask people to play Kim's game, so if you ask Western cultures and indigenous cultures to play Kim's game, which is where you take the objects off the table and you ask them to put them back, and you throw in a twist where you move the table in between, indigenous cultures will put the objects back oriented to the room or the context, and Western cultures will tend to put them back oriented to the table.
Yeah, the context. I mean, I did a lot of my work in Kakadu in the 70s, right? So I've done a lot of work with Australian Aboriginal communities, which are more different than any others. Yeah? And if you don't know it, it was genocide. One of my formative experiences is at 22, being an Aboriginal land rights activist literally shot in front of me by a mine security guard. He just walked out and killed him. And we went to the police and they said it's only an Abo. Yeah, and actually got worse because we went back to Geneva. I was World Council of Churches then, and nobody would listen to us because the whole focus was on South America, which was a tribal conflict actually in many ways. Yeah, whereas in Australia, it was basically genocide. If you don't know it, in Australia, until 1973, half-breed children were forcibly taken away from their parents and interbred back to white in homes. Yeah, that's going on in the 70s. Yeah. Now, I learned a huge amount in Kakadu, particularly the role of what's called ritual dissent. And Aboriginal decision-making is about maximizing dissent to increase scanning before you reach consensus. No? So there are different ways of thinking, but they are portable. If you want the really simple tests, there's a book called Geography of Thought, which is trivial but fun. And you ask people, which is the odd one out, cow, chicken, or grass? Okay, Ben knows this one because he's been on the course, all right? So just have a quick think and I'll rely on you to be honest, all right? The Northern European, North American norm is to say, well, it's obvious grass is the odd one out because it's a vegetable and the other two are animals. The African, Asian, Celtic fringe norm is to say, well, the cow's got a relationship with grass, so chicken is the odd one out.
Yeah. So it's basically there isn't that ecosystem, analysis. So Ben, did you want to?
Sorry, very briefly, it links in with complexity. Complexity says connections matter more than things. So how people connect is far more important than what they are, which is again why we shift away from this individual coaching metaphor in terms of change.
And actually, before we bring Ben S in, this is kind of one of my kind of little private beefs, and I won't kind of get in it now. But you know, Chris and I work in enterprise architecture, and my big beef is actually the lines are more important. Everybody's drawing freaking rectangles, and all of the value seems to be about understanding the lines, and nobody wants to talk about the lines. So
it's not photograph, it looks just like Toga. That's what I find hysterical.
Ben S.
No, I was just gonna I was drawn to the point on the need for more generalists, and I completely agree, because just the other day I think we got into a bit of a, not debate, but it was against utility, and someone was talking there's this obsession with utility. We only want to do what is useful. It needs to provide some immediate utility, and it got to a point where we were like, why should we go to space? And I'm like, wow. Because there's no immediate utility in going to space. And it's it brings me to when you pointed out the collective goals. And it's what is our collective why as a planet? What is this collective why we all work towards collectively as China and America? And I think there's a stark difference as well there, to the point of perception with both of them. And I think their heritage has a lot to do with it, because if you remember, China is the oldest country on the planet. They've known themselves to be China for close to 3,000 years, as opposed to America, which is almost it's not even 500 years old.
Can I just bring in just a quick point? This reminds me of conversations I've had maybe 6 months or so ago with David Ronsfeld. I don't know if you know the TINM guy, so the Rand Corporation guy. So David Ronsfeld's got this study of organizational systems called TINM. So he's saying it's basically tribe, institution, market, and network. And I suppose the price of things, when we talk about the price of value, that's maybe more of a market type of model.
It's a classic Western approach. We want things in little boxes.
Right.
Yeah, and it's this focus on categorization rather than relationship. And I've argued this with him, all right? And Julian, who's in Rand, has also argued it with him. The minute you create categories, you have boundary condition problems.
Exactly.
Where something, and you allow people to be categorized, right? And the fascinating thing, coming back to something Ben said, is we actually know that art is critical to human evolution. Art comes before language in human evolution. And the reason it works is it allows us to disconnect from the material so we make novel connections, which is why it's cruel to remove it from education. So, and the constant North American norm is put things in boxes. Yeah. Now, if you look at systems architecture, the work we're doing, which we've been doing with Rand, I mean, that's where we got into the conversation, is what you actually need is a scaffolding. And scaffolding can be internal, external, resilient, robust, replacement, neutral, whatever. Then you need things to interact around the scaffolding, so that effectively architecture is about allowing applications to emerge from those interactions rather than designing them. And the same is true in organizations. You can't design an organization. You can create scaffolding and interactions and respond to what happens.
Yeah. Caroline and Mandy, you want to come in?
Just one quick, you're forgetting one very important thing about the supply of artists, though, of course, is that very soon we're going to need lots more cybersecurity experts, and where else are we going to get them if we haven't trained people in art? Yeah,
no, I actually agree with you. And remember, I've been working with GTHQ on this, right? And if you go to GTHQ, they have a huge amount of humanities graduates. Yeah, not engineering graduates, because actually, if you really want to understand things like counterterrorism and those things, you've got to have people who understand people. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Hermeneutics is the ability to infer the existence of things from what's missing in text, and you don't get that those kinds of insights from people who are used to having everything given to them literally in concrete terms, so that they're not imaginative. They're not having their imagination stimulated by the process of interpretation.
It's my standard joke about AI, all right, because I worked in AI most of my life, and we developed sense makers to create training data. Because the problem is training data sets are currently produced by misogynist young males in the west coast of America who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty. And taking Ayn Rand seriously at any age is a sign of mental derangement, right? But that's what the world is being built around at the moment.
So lots of dark side. Caroline and Mandy, did you want to come in on that at all? Or Chris, indeed?
I'm just really glad that, Dave, you've said that art is really important, because my youngest is studying art. So that really does make me happy.
I had a question, David, and I think because I'm kind of now seeking help in terms of, you've mentioned scaffolding, and I think, assuming, if you are operating within, should we say, a traditional Western company, at least I am, and I think that we've, Chris and I have done some good progress in trying to make this about providing places for other things to emerge, and I'm not quite sure. I don't know if there's any. Are there any practical examples that within the framework of a PLC of what that scaffolding could look like, or am I just screwed?
Well, and I think it's changing. I mean, once we finish this, after I've got 2 big projects I've got to finish off tonight. One is the definition of a reconciliation post-American election program for some very senior people in Washington, based on work we did in Colombia on peace and reconciliation, because you can't overcome the level of schism there is in America unless you have a radical rethink. But you've got to change the game, right? The other one is with 2 of the big consultancies, both tonight and tomorrow, because they're starting to take on complexity methods because their clients are no longer happy with structured techniques. What COVID has triggered is a realization it won't work anymore. So we're actually currently packaging up everything we do so the big consultancies can take it. Yeah. And I think that's going to get more important. But we spent 2 years working on scaffolding. And we have a whole typology of it. So scaffolding can be external or endo, internal or external. It can be resilient or robust, and I don't mean Palet's definitions of those. Yeah. And there's also things like nutrient lattices, which you put in place and things grow around the lattice, but then they dissolve in. There's microcardial lattices. So we've been creating this typology of scaffolding. So you look at the level of uncertainty in your business, you choose scaffolding, you define people and software to the lowest viable level of granularity, define their interactions and their polymorphism, and that system's architecture. Then you stimulate the interaction around the scaffolding and the applications will emerge.
So, sorry, go on, Chris.
I guess I probably need to do some reading, but I'm just trying to understand. I get the analogies. It was just as a practical example of a scaffolding.
Okay, well, look at social media. So social media, all right, fundamentally is an emergent property. We can't predict what social media will do. It actually works at a finely grained level with open APIs and multiple interactions. And then practices emerge like hashtags. Who would have thought a hashtag would be the most significant thing you need to know? Right? So basically, the whole of social media is the emergent property of the interaction of objects around scaffolding. So it's not like there isn't a good example.
Yeah.
And that's where companies need to go, because, I started off with object orientation together with legacy system management and RAD-Gen. Yeah, that was the first thing I did, right? When I was put into corporate strategy. And it was all about object encapsulation of legacy code so that you could use it within the modern system rather than rewrite it. But everybody wanted to rewrite it. Why rewrite something if you can bound it and define input-output? And legacy objects can be polymorphic, which makes them even more useful.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, Dave, and that's the understatement of the year. But I think, if we go back to the dark side, which is great, that's really good. But if we go to the dark side theme of the show, what we're talking about, we talked earlier about hubris. We talked about the fact that people don't agree on the why. We talked about lots and lots of other things. But I suppose what we're saying, almost like to simplify it, we're saying people are kind of going about things the wrong. People aren't really looking at the world in a way that would allow them to solve some of these challenges we face. It's almost like we're doing it all wrong.
I think that goes back to Chris's point that it's all our fault, though, isn't it? That's the way that we've led people to be. You know, we have directed people in this kind of personalisation. Don't think about the collective. Think about yourself. Keep moving towards goals rather than sensing where you're going. Forget about sensing anything because we've got a post-it note that will dictate where you need to be. And so we've kind of lost all of our intuition. And so really, sorry, Dave, I continue.
We don't understand the energy gradients. What neoliberalism did politically was to homogenize politics. So people couldn't see a difference between left and right. When you homogenize that, the energy gradient of extremism drops down, which is why you get Trump and why you get Boris. And Boris is currently trying to out-compete Trump in stupidity. And the scary thing is he may succeed in it, right? So we haven't understood that. There's also something fascinating. It's called constructor theory in physics, which is worth looking up. It's linked with Dukas. I'm not sure about in physics, but social systems, it's good. What it basically says is natural law tells you about constraints. And within those constraints, whatever has the lowest energy gradient is going to win. Now, one of the things Trump is brilliant at is he uses keywords to trigger what are called tropes in narrative theory, i.e. attractor wells of micro anecdotes, which actually suck people in that they can't escape from. So if you want to change Trump, you can't attack him directly because you'll increase the energy. You have to create alternative attractors to suck the energy away. And those sort of very basic facts is what we need people to understand. If you want to transform an organization, don't try and transform it directly, try and transform it indirectly.
Yeah. And funny enough, Dave, Chris and I have been, I've been successful, as it were, in terms of using guilds bottom up and really just letting them evolve and develop organically. And again, they haven't necessarily gone in the direction that we could predict, but they're sort of changing things. They're creating new modes and things. Now, we do actually have a question from Radu Daniel, and he or she has asked, is there a relation between the group size and nurturing interactions?
This is Dunbar. I mean, Robin Dunbar is the best of the evolutionary psychologists, all right? But you've got to treat it with caution, and Agile have disrupted it. So we know, I normally talk about 5, 15, 150, and 5 million. All right, so teams of less than 5, if you look at crisis teams, they're always smaller than 5. Because the cognitive load of maintaining trust is just too much. And interestingly, these are sports teams and military units, so it's not surprising. 15 is the maximum limit of the people who can simultaneously trust each other. Yeah, 150, which is Dunbar's original research, is quite limited. We now actually think 5 million is the maximum size a country can get to maintain cultural coherence. Yeah, the minute it goes above that, you get incoherence. So these aren't exact, but there is something about the number of interactions which can be maintained, which actually gives you some type of phase shift in terms of behavior between size of groups.
So presumably that has implications for organisational design, doesn't it?
Well, look what's happened in the UK. I mean, and I have to confess it. I'm not a yes Cymru behind me. I'm a Welsh nationalist, all right? Because Wales is viable within Europe, but not viable within Britain, ironically. Right? If you look at it, Wales and Scotland have very different COVID policies. Manchester is now in open rebellion. The city-states. Yeah, and I've said for a long time, the future is city-states and small companies. Because actually they can have cultural cohesion. Yeah, what happens to the bits between we're not sure about. But if you don't have cultural cohesion, and this is a key concept, nobody can make what Terry Eagleton calls a radical sacrifice.
So just on that then, Dave. So if we're talking about the fact that we can have this cultural cohesion, and to the extent of numbers that we are in the size of countries or macro cities or whatever that shape looks like, why is it so many organisations fail to get cultural cohesion within themselves, despite all of their engagement programs, their value programs? And I'm asking the question slightly tongue-in-cheek because I feel like I slightly know the answer.
It's because of those programs.
Yeah. Okay.
Right? I mean, there's a very simple rule here, right? If you have teenagers, do you tackle problems directly or indirectly?
Indirectly.
Right. Okay. What have HR departments been doing for the past 40 years? Trying to make explicit the tacit. Yeah. And actually, HR departments, quite interesting. There used to be an ex-military guy with a couple of secretaries. Now they're vast departments which actually generate more bureaucracy than anybody else. Right.
Yeah.
So the issue here is, and it's like the example I gave of me being taught to do impromptu debating. That made me hypercritical. It was a process which made me critical. I wasn't taught to be critical.
Okay.
And this is the part about embedded and enacted. Organizational change is about changing constraints and changing energy gradients and seeing what happens. It's not about deciding what sort of organization you want to be.
Agreed.
And also, Dave, what you were saying earlier about the language and the way that you communicate and connect with people is so vital, because actually in a lot of organizations everywhere, you're not really a person or a human being, you're a resource. You're just a number on a sheet. You're not even an asset, because it's the hardware that's an asset. It's the you're just a resource. You're not even an asset.
It was quite interesting. I actually taught leadership with Peter Drucker for about 4 years. And that was after I criticized Frederick Taylor in a keynote just before Peter Drucker taught, and I got torn apart. I ended up with a ritual puddle of humiliation on the floor from a 93-year-old genius. But he decided I was retrievable and took me out for a meal. Now, one of the things we came to, I stopped criticizing Taylor, because Taylor automated what could be automated, but actually left an apprentice model in place for management. Yeah. And what happened with systems thinking is we assumed that people were assets. It's why you get pseudosciences like Myers-Briggs. Yeah, the desire to put people into a box because we're treating them as replaceable units off the spare shelves in the manufacturing process. So that reintroduction of apprentice models is something we're bringing back in complexity, because there's whole bodies of things like London taxi drivers. It takes 2.5 years to get the knowledge, because the brain has to physically alter through the process. Yeah.
So we've got. Sorry, go on, Dave.
No, I was just saying that. What I'm getting to is there is actually known science. So one more example, and I'll shut up on this. We know from every scientific study, when people are working for explicit goals, it destroys intrinsic motivation. There is zero evidence to contradict that. Where do we have the highest number of explicit goals? Education, health, social services. Where do we most need intrinsic motivation? So we have an anti-science orthodoxy in management, in government, in industry, and we've got to break that.
Yeah, and we've already Tim brought up before you joined the Upton Sinclair quote as well. That's relevant here. Ben Bennett.
Yeah, no, and I was just gonna come back to the scaffolding, because in programming, we have this thing called programming debt, and it's as you're coding, when you know that there's mistakes but you don't address them and you kind of keep going. And I kind of liked what you said before about the boundary conditions when Western society wants to make these boxes. And it's if you look at Western society, it's been developing for the last 500 years. So we've been making these boxes where we're basically saying gravity is 9.8, and we say, okay, 10 is good enough. And you make the box and you kind of set it. And then we build on this. And now it's 2020, and it's almost this leaning tower of programming bits. And
it's the old joke about railway tracks being a distance apart of a Roman chariot. We basically, which actually isn't true, but it's an interesting method.
Yeah.
We train patterns of thinking which we find it difficult to break.
So we got two more questions from the audience, and then maybe we can go over to Caroline for some conversation about what you've heard so far and your reaction to it. So the first one is from Anna, which is, how do you stimulate increased cohesion? And if we can keep it brief, so we can kind of get on to Caroline.
Well, I gave you an example
earlier.
All right, we're looking at overlapping trios. So in an organisation, we'll find 20 roles. We're just doing this in the NHS at the moment. All right. So, for example, in terms of we're going to have a mental health breakdown in January worldwide. because everybody thinks this stuff will be over. It won't be over till 2022, right? So we're doing things like pupil, parent, teacher trios, then teacher, social work, and health worker trios. So we define 20 roles. We then define interactions between those roles, and we stimulate narrative exchange, which is something we can do electronically between those groups to provide peer-to-peer support. So what we're actually doing is deliberately designing network connectivity in order to create resilience in the system. And resilience is survival with continuity of identity over time. It means you survive by changing. Yeah. And by the way, anti-fragile is just one type of that. It's nothing special. We knew about that way before Taleb came.
Right. So last question then on to Caroline, and that's from Dave Pendle. What are the types of cultural attractors to counteract the low energy vortices, e.g. Trump Johnson?
We work on micro-narrative. This is called vector theory of change. So we allow, I mean, the critical thing we do is we allow people to interpret their own stories, because power comes in interpretation. So if you use text analytics or specialists, it's not there. That's quant, not qual. Sorry, I've got a background in physics. So from a physicist's point of view, no social scientist has ever had enough data to form any valid conclusion. Yeah? So we wanted to develop that. So we use that, right? We then use that for fitness landscapes, which come from evolutionary biology. And so you look at stories adjacent to the negative and say, what can we do tomorrow to create more stories like that and fewer stories like these? Now, that's called vector theory of change, because to say, how do we actually create a more humane society? People will say, we already are. If you say, how can we create more stories like those and fewer stories like that, everybody can engage. And that's kind of like the way you achieve change. It's this small incremental steps to an adjacent possible. And narrative is the most profound form of human understanding, because it carries with it ambiguity. And if you remove ambiguity, you remove sense making and you remove development.
And what we can do then is we can then segue the narrative to Caroline and her, her reactions to what you've heard tonight so far.
Well, I think it's all fairly simple, really, and easy to wrap up. Not. I think Chris's point about the fact that we thought we were going to teach a dog new tricks has actually proven its way throughout the show. So it's become a bit of a theme, because actually what we weren't doing was teaching. What we should have been doing was learning, to Tim's point. I think also what we learnt was that whilst we're working with patterns and behaviours and we're following these trends and these directives, we need to interrupt that with the why, but there's a complexity to the why in terms of our ego and where we want to get to and where we want to go according to the goal that we're trying to achieve. And as Dave said, we're not meant to be trying to achieve a goal, we're meant to be sensing a direction forward, and that's probably the best way to influence the direction of travel. Because what we're not trying to do is to tell, it's actually trying to bring a collective with us for a greater purpose. And what that greater purpose looks like is different for everybody, but needs to become the collective whole. So I guess some of the key points of interest around that is looking at brain plasticity, to Dave's point. So what is, nature over nurture, and what that means from different regions and different countries and different ways of working, and what we can learn from that, and how we can remove some of the arrogance that we have off the Western table into being a bit more explorative. But there's times and places to do that. So what is the darkness around transformation? I think it comes back to innate fear and storytelling. I think it comes back to the way that our brains work and our synapses and how they respond to both the environment controls and our previous experience of transformation, and how that can direct us in either the right way or the wrong way going forward. I think it's really important that we learn rather than teach, and that we remove some of the old frameworks that we've been used to. Certainly burn all the post-it notes. I'm quite happy for Halloween fire tomorrow night. I'll go post-it notes, and I think we need to start that trend, everybody. Let's burn the transformation sack of answers or tricks in a bag, and move forward. And I think the only way to move forward is intuitively, collectively, and with a common goal that has to not only respect the organisation but the planet. And having said that, that should all be quite easy to do, and I'll expect that to be done by Monday. But
yeah,
That's a good summary.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, is it Halloween in 2 days' time? So that was pretty scary, actually, wasn't it? I mean, it's so what I seem to get from that is we're doing it all wrong. Our hubris is meaning we're not really addressing that, and it's not in our best interest to think about that differently.
I think I put it slightly differently from that. I think we're doing something right, but we're making things we do right universal, and we're not realizing we need to do things differently. So I learned by teaching. It's not an either or. It's a both and. Yeah, and I think that's the issue about context sensitivity. We need to understand the context in which different things work, and that's kind of like an evolutionary process.
Well, this reminds me, so I'm trying to tie things slightly back to some of the previous episodes. And on episode 1, we had David Dibble talking about dissipative structures and prigogine. And he was talking about also the idea of the receptive pull, and rather a compassionate pull rather than a kind of a target, reaching push. So I think that seems to be also something, the lack of compassion in the way we're trying to transform is clearly part of the problem here.
Chris, I've got I think hopefully a fairly brief summary pulling in David Snowden's statement about the importance of narrative. One of the things, I had a similar education, I think, at the grammar school to you, David, and I remember one of my very first Latin lessons was where we were taught poetae fabulam narrant. So if we deconstruct that, it was many poets were telling a single story. I think to some extent we are like that. We are here. We are telling a single story. We're narrating from our own perspectives and feeding into a common story. And I think if we can promote collective storytelling, like we're doing here in this group, then we will be doing something that has been part of human history for millennia and needs to be part of human history. Collective storytelling needs to be something that we take forward.
It might be a reason why we leave more myths than anything behind, or why we found so many and not actual yeah.
If you want the worst example, look at what Disney did with the European folktale tradition. So the European folktales are deep, dark, dangerous stories because that's how we teach kids to avoid danger. Then Disney comes along. Right? And actually, Disney and Billy Graham are the metaphor for modern management consultants. It's saccharine and anodyne, and you've got to come to the mercy seat and accept patriarchal authority for your future life. That's the way management consultants work.
So do we need more dark side transformational fairy tales then in organizations?
There's a famous phrase from Polana, we always know more than we can say. I extended that to say we always know more than we can say, and we can always say more than we can write down. So the process of going from my head to my mouth to hands involves loss, but all of them are important. It's not one or the other, it's all of them are critical. Yeah, some things have to be written down, some things can only be known for years of experience. It's a combination of those, and the last thing we want is for people to abandon logic and codification in favor of a complete narrative approach, because then I'm very sorry, Trump is better at that than most of you. Yeah. Yeah. There's 2 books by Terry Eagleton I've been recommended a lot at the moment. If you don't know Terry Eagleton, he, like me, was a Catholic Marxist. We were both on the editorial board of a Catholic Marxist journal in the 70s. But he's written 2 brilliant books. One is called Radical Sacrifice, and the other is Hope Without Optimism. So if you want a message, we're going to have to do radical sacrifices to provide this species, and we should never abandon hope, but optimism is not the same thing as hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. That's very sobering. So I was struggling to get the humour in on this episode.
You did call it the dark side.
I abandoned my gimmick as well. So I had a box with where is it? Brian Eno, Peter Schmidt, what is it? You know, those cards to random it up like as a trick or treat. But I abandoned that because the conversations that gimmick will have to be thrown away and used next week. But okay, brilliant. So there's a little bit. I'm now worrying with 45 seconds left whether one show a week is enough to unpack all of this shit. And blimey, it feels like it should just be on 24/7, like a news. How we sort this stuff out.
We
But
need
anyway,
time for reflection.
well, indeed, yes, indeed. And on that note, we're pretty much out of time. So I really enjoyed that, and I thought what I particularly liked is that we're starting to break it down, and playing with the format is starting to feel like it's more like a conversation, which I really enjoy. So I'd like to thank Chris Sherrington, Ben Ford, Caroline Griffiths, Dave Snowden, Ben Sankar. I've forgotten. Ben, what's your second name? Sangwar, thank you. Tim Williams, Mandy Sunner, and thank you for basically StreamYard putting together a great platform. And most of all, thank you to the audience who've been tuning in, and of course the audience who'll be watching on replay later, who will be the largest part of the audience. And that's all we have time for today. So I've been your host, Chris Patton. Goodbye.
Thanks, Chris.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.